Bonnie and Mr. Paal to get actually success. We have finally managed to get it done. To get it done. To put Dawei all together with Bonnie and with Mr. Paal, because last time it failed due to the busy schedule of everyone.
Sheldon, how many people do you have signed up to listen in?
I think it is so far, I think there's a couple of the audience, like it is 10 audience, but we still can wait for a minute to see.
People didn't have to tell you in advance if they were going to sign up?
Yeah, but we also have a live stream like channel, so they can join in the webinar, or either they can watch the live stream. So yeah.
Yeah, and later on we are going to put it onto the YouTube, onto the Twitter. Yeah. Okay, now it's 9 o'clock. It's 9 a.m. here in Hong Kong, and so shall we start?
Yeah, I think we can get started. Yeah, hello everyone, and good afternoon for you guys in the East Coast, and good morning in Hong Kong. So my name is Sheldon Xie, the research fellow at the Center for Globalization Hong Kong. Welcome to our last session on the CGHK Insight Dialogue on the 2024 Taiwan elections. So the CGHK is an independent and unparalleled Hong Kong-based think tank dedicated to policy research and strategic consultation for private enterprises and governmental agencies. So we also actively serve as a public platform for policymakers and scholars and even students across the world to consult and exchange their views on various global affairs. So I guess everyone in this room still found the Taiwan election result in the past weekend unsurprising. Taiwan's Vice President Lai Ching-te from the Democratic Progressive Party, DPP, who led the public opinion poll through the election campaign, has won the race just over 40% of the vote. Lai's victory marks the third consecutive achievement for the DPP. It's the only time for any political party in Taiwan become the ruling party for 3 4-year terms since the first direct presidential vote in 1996. So in his acceptance speech, Mr. Lai pledged to follow the Taiwan's footsteps, preserving the Cross-Strait status quo, and he said he had an important responsibility to maintain the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. However, what Lai said has raised a lot of skepticism as his records as a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. Therefore, pressing questions emerged. Can the US and China discover a proper approach to uphold peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait without being provoked by Lai Ching-te's government, especially in upcoming 520s in his inaugurations? And is it convincible for the US and China to avoid the steering to military confrontation in the Indo-Pacific due to the DPP's more pro-independence positions, especially after the Lai Ching-te were set up? Given the United States' current involvement in the unfinished Ukraine war and Hamas and Israel conflict in the Middle East, can the US effectively manage another militarized conflict in the Taiwan Strait? And what will be the subsequent impact on the US-led international order in the Indo-Pacific? So for many questions, I think this session will specifically dive into the implication of the Taiwan election outcomes on Asian security. So in response to this pivotal moment, the CGHK has initiated this dialogue series to comprehend this nuance on this evolving dynamics. So today, I think we have a lot of I'm really honored to introduce our esteemed panelists who were joining us with this some kind of special expertise and professionals. First, we have got Mrs. Bonnie Glaser, who is the managing director of the Indo-Pacific program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And her recent articles in the Foreign Affairs, Taiwan and the True Source of Deterrence has raised a lot of heated discussions in the policy field, either in Taiwan, China, and also in the United States. So I really look forward to hear Mrs. Glaser's revisit her arguments, especially in the post-Taiwan election time. And then we have Mr. Douglas Paal, who is a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and also the former director of the American Institute in Taiwan in the early 20s. So that's 2000s. So he is really a real practitioner in the Taiwan affairs. And last but not least, we have Professor Dawei, who is the director of the Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. And as we probably heard the previous discussions, Professor Dawei has led the delegations in the United States last year and have engaged in a lot of the U.S.-China exchanges. So and also he sends a delegation and hosts exchanges and also a discussion with George Washington University. So we have a really great discussion. So Professor Dawei is also a great figure to discuss these important issues. Last but not least, we have Dr. Peter Qiu, our chairman of the CGHK adjunct professor at Hong Kong Baptist University, who will moderate today's discussions. So I will turn the floor to our moderator, Dr. Qiu, and following his opening remarks, Dr. Qiu will guide our discussion, and each panelist will begin a brief 5-minute remarks, and then after that, there will be an engaging and a free discussion among our panelists. We will conclude with the Q&A session, and our audience can put their questions through the Q&A box on the webinar. And before we wrap it up, so Dr. Qiu, I will turn the floor to yours.
Okay, thank you, Sheldon. Yeah. Okay, everyone. Good morning and good evening and good afternoon as well. Yeah. Okay. Now the Taiwan election is over. Results is there. No need to introduction how important it is, how complicated it is, and how difficult it is both for Lai Ching-te, for Beijing, and for Washington. Basically, I think it's not only a matter between mainland China and Taiwan, particularly on the side of Taiwan with Lai Ching-te, but mostly it's also more is a matter of Beijing and Washington. Yeah, as I said before, no need to say why it is. So actually now looking at that, so I would say now basically both United States and China are facing two huge challenges. Even now, if we try to look at what's going on, what was going on in the last few days, it was still a little bit quiet between Lai Ching-te and Beijing. Beijing made a symbolic public statement. Lai Ching-te say some very soft sentences and words. So it looks like everyone was still waiting and see. United States sent a delegation to Taiwan. James Steinberg, Stephen Hartley, and Laura Rosenberg, they left Taipei, I think, on Monday or on Tuesday, so 3 days ago. So now we are basically facing two stages. One is the stage before the 20th of May. The other one is after the 20th of May. I would say even after the 20th of May, at most, what we can try to predict is sometimes between until the end of the year. We're not going to predict what's going on in next year, in 2025, because there might be another year's president. If another year's president here, things are going to change. So at least in a constructive way, in a predictable way, in a feasible way, as long as we manage to focus on these two stages, I think we can still try to work out something. And by the way, you guys are all old hands for China, for Taiwan, and between China and the United States. Particularly, Bonnie, you wrote, along with your colleagues, a very good article in Foreign Affairs saying, United States, why should the United States reassure, not just threaten China? And you guys suggested that both sides, Taiwan, now on the side of Taiwan is Lai Ching-te, and China and the United States needs to reassure so that this triangle again will be moving on in a more constructive way. So now it's time after the election, it's time for all the parties to sit down and to think about how and to what extent we can try to implement as you guys suggested. So I would say let's get started. I will leave everyone 5-6 minutes to make your own remarks first, and then we can go to a further panel discussion. So, lady first, Bonnie.
Well, thank you, Peter, and it's such a privilege to be here with you and Dawei and Paal to talk about the Taiwan elections. I do have to say, since you mentioned the Foreign Affairs article that I co-authored with Tom Christensen and Jessica Chun Weiss, that we did call for all three sides to make their assurances credible, not only focus on making their threats credible. So obviously, we called on Beijing to take steps as well, and that should not be ignored. But I'm not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the Taiwan elections and Lai Ching-te's policies going forward. And I'll start by saying that I think we should expect continuity in Taiwan's policies on most issues, including policy toward mainland China, at least at the outset of his administration. As you said, he will be inaugurated on May 20th. Lai Ching-te has said that he will continue Tsai Ing-wen's approach to Beijing, including maintaining the cross-strait status quo. And he said in his acceptance speech that he would adhere to the ROC constitutional order. In my view, Lai does not seek confrontation with Beijing. He wants to preserve Taiwan's democracy and freedoms. He does not want military conflict. And as you noted, only 40% of Taiwan's voters cast their vote for Lai. And of course, that means 60% did not. And the DPP lost its majority in the Legislative Yuan. So even if Lai had the ambition to take steps to change the status quo, he will be constrained to some extent by the reality that he does not have a strong political mandate, nor a majority in the legislature. And perhaps Beijing can take some comfort in the fact that most voters in Taiwan wanted a change of government, which honestly isn't surprising in a democracy after 8 years of rule by the same party. Now, Beijing's reaction so far, I think, has been within expectations. The statement by the Taiwan Affairs Office, I think, was relatively muted. There were comments that Wang Yi made when he was in Cairo, which were a little bit tougher. He reiterated, of course, that reunification is an historical inevitability, which is what Xi Jinping said in his New Year's address. He repeated that Taiwan is China's Taiwan, things that have been said previously. So not beyond our expectations. But we should also pay attention to actions. And the first action that Beijing has taken is to poach one of Taiwan's, what they call their diplomatic allies. They're now down to 12. Nauru, a very small island state in the Pacific, it announced that it was severing its diplomatic ties with Taiwan and establishing diplomatic relations with Beijing. Now, this is also part of Beijing's playbook. We know that in 2016, Beijing established diplomatic ties with the Gambia, which had months earlier, broken its diplomatic ties with Taiwan. But because of the diplomatic truce with Ma Ying-jeou, Beijing had sort of left them in limbo and picked them up as a diplomatic partner after Tsai Ing-wen won the election. We've also seen some what I would call semi-authoritative sources threatening to impose tariffs on more of Taiwanese exports to mainland China. There was an article in the China Daily by a Taiwan expert from Xiamen University who even implied that the entire economic cooperation framework agreement could be suspended. But we already saw, even before the election, a dozen products from Taiwan that had tariffs reimposed on them. Economic pressure by Beijing on Taiwan is not new. So I would say that's also within the realm of what we expect and is part of Beijing's playbook. We haven't seen any significant military response yet. I not convinced that at some point we will not see more military exercises beyond what we usually see around Taiwan in the air defense identification zone, but we'll see. So my hope is that Beijing will listen to what Lai says in his inaugural address, observe his actions as president, and judge him by his statements and his actions going forward, not those of the past. It is, I think, unreasonable to draw hard and fast assessments of Lai Ching-te based on things he has done in the past. He should be judged as president. And I believe that Beijing should revive communication channels with Taipei, though I'm not optimistic that they will do so, because I think that the absence of direct communication results in misunderstanding, misperceptions, and potentially miscalculation. If Beijing's policy toward Taiwan does not change, then cross-strait tensions will continue and possibly grow, and the mainland will probably increase diplomatic, economic, military pressure on Taiwan. I think it's unlikely that Beijing will use military force against Taiwan in the next 4 years, but that possibility is not zero. Just to talk a bit about reaction of countries in the region, I think regional states and, of course, countries around the world are concerned about the possibility of a cross-strait military conflict. And there is more that the United States is likely to do in order to try and deter Beijing from using force. And they will work with other countries in the region, particularly Japan, which has an especially high stake in the preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And other countries do as well. And as you know, I work with Europe, and there's growing concern in Europe. And therefore, there is a willingness in Europe and other countries to take steps to warn Xi Jinping against using force in the Taiwan Strait. Just one more point, and that is to cite an article last week, I think it was published by Bloomberg Economics, and they estimated that the price tag of a Taiwan Strait war would be about 10 trillion US dollars, which is about 10% of global GDP. And about a year ago, Rhodium Group in New York forecast that a PRC blockade that does not involve kinetic action would have an impact on the global economy of at least $2 trillion. So these kind of estimates, I think, have really awakened many countries around the world that a military conflict or even the action of a blockade that does not use kinetic force would have very negative consequences for every part of the world. And so no country really wants to see a war in the Taiwan Strait. And I think it is first and foremost the responsibility of Beijing and Taipei to manage their differences peacefully. And I'll stop there, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Brilliant. So it looks, as you said before, a little bit quiet, and to some extent, as long as it is quiet, it could be constructive. But maybe, don't you think, is that still a waiting time and a testing time for every parties? Every party is waiting just for the other parties to act first, then we are going to respond. So anyhow, so now it's up to Lai Ching-te to say something, and then Beijing will be going to respond. So United States, the U.S. led delegation is back to Washington. So I think during these days, maybe now it's up to Washington to make its own assessment. Looking forward to Mr. Paal, looking forward to what's going on with the 20th May's inauguration speech. You know, everyone is focusing on that. So if we try to compare what used to going on 20 years ago with Chen Shui-bian, during that time you were in Taipei, and it was very difficult for United States to press, to influence Chen Shui-bian. So Dennis Wilder was in our cinema webinar 2 days ago. He told us we don't know how difficult it was for the United States to influence, to press Chen Shui-bian, and George W. Bush was very angry during that time. But even I don't think it's comparable, due to the grand geopolitical context between the United States and China. Even if on the superficial level, maybe we can compare something, Yeah, because 20 years ago, everyone was talking about G2, everyone was talking about China, America. Basically the trust between the United States and China was not to compare with what's going on now between Beijing and Washington. But again, Lai Ching-te and Chen Shui-bian, to what extent it is to compare, to what extent, but still, both China and the United States, they have some domestic interests in the year 2024. China has some domestic problem, military, economically. United States is facing to election, and not to mention still 2 wars still running out, one in Ukraine, one in Middle East. And now North Korea is cooking very hot, right? Starting from Tuesday, Kim Jong-un said, oh, we're going to give up, abandoning the goal of unification. Who knows what's going to happen in North Korea, on the Korean Peninsula. So again, in this regard, in this sense, it's really very important to influence Lai Ching-te so that nothing will be out of control, at least before the 20th May or after the 20th May. So I named so many facts in the history because try to stimulate the wisdom and the thoughts of Mr. Paal.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you to CGHK for bringing us all together today. Let me just pick up from your comments about the Chen Shui-bian period and the efforts to influence him back in that time. And I think you stated, among other things, that it's really not a comparable situation. I want to emphasize that. When Chen Shui-bian came into office, he had some things in common with Lai Ching-te. He'd been a politician in the South. He'd been a longtime independence activist. Excuse me. But he also had been, very little into domestic affairs beyond being mayor of Taipei for a period, and had not had any international experience that was of substance or cross-strait experience. And really, he didn't expect to win. It was circumstances thrust him into office that were not fully anticipated. And yet the U.S. was able to influence him in his May 20 remarks back then. He said some things like the Sibu Imeo and Weilai de Ika Zhongguo, which phrases are now often forgotten, but he did try to respond to American concerns that he would be, at that time we didn't talk about status quo so much, but that he would be someone who would upset the status quo. Today, Lai Ching-te, like Tsai Ing-wen before him, has come into office with real experience at the national level, cross-strait skills and observations, if not actual participation. So he's not a newborn figure on the scene. And so it's I think we have to be careful not to draw strong comparisons between that period and what followed and what may come forward in the Lai Ching-te period in office. Having said that, I think it's important also to look at other things surrounding those circumstances. If you look back in 1996, 2000, 2020, very strong things were said by the mainland on the eve of the elections, trying to sort of scare voters into supporting a candidate that Beijing may have preferred as opposed to the one who was elected. And I think this time we've seen quite a different approach by Beijing. There's much less strenuous vocalization and threat by senior leaders on the eve of the election. China did some things in terms of online interference or fake activities and to try to move voters one way or another, but it wasn't at the same level of screaming officials like Zhu Rongji back in 2000 or Xi Jinping's remarks on the eve of the election in 2020, which helped actually to increase the DPP or back in Li Denghui's days, his turnout in the election. This time China showed restraint. And I think it's worth noting not only did China show restraint of a sort, the US and Taiwan also did. So we've had an important election about which a great deal of media speculation focused in the months and weeks leading up to it, with a heavy emphasis on militarization or military outcomes or conflicts that may emerge as a result of the anticipated or final election results. And we didn't see that. We saw rather, over the past year, the US has returned to quite conventional references to Taiwan. It's supported the exercise of democracy on the island. Lai Ching-te, for his part, emphasized maintenance of the status quo and continuation, as you said in your remarks, of the Tsai Ing-wen government's policies. And on the Chinese side, we've seen a failure to deploy forces opposite Taiwan in a way to intimidate the voters on the eve of the election. These are three different kinds of restraint, but I think all of them together have helped to put us into a better position to manage the current period and going forward. Bonnie mentioned in her remarks it would be good to start having communications between the mainland and Taiwan on a more regular basis. And I think I can't help but endorse that. And between now and the inauguration is a great time for that kind of communication to take place. If trusted intermediaries can be identified and asked to convey the thinking of the incoming administration or the thinking of China with respect to the incoming Lai administration, if the US can be a message carrier, whether it's its own message or helps to speak on behalf of people in Taiwan, or can listen to what China has to say about the upcoming months and management of this transition on Taiwan, I think that would all be to the good. We need more communication. I'm sure the US and Taiwan will have very intense communication through AIT and other means. There's a political delegation which has announced its intention to come to Taiwan to celebrate the victory. We've already had a bipartisan high-level representation, which confined itself to public remarks that are consistent with longstanding American policy toward Taiwan. So the elements that promote stability have been more in evidence than has been the case in previous elections. And I think that's an encouraging sign. As Bonnie suggested, we don't know what the future will bring. Lai has to make choices about the language he uses in his inaugural speech and the policy agenda he seeks to pursue. Lai is, to be frank, very strictly constrained, not just by not controlling the Li Fa-yuan in the way he might have hoped through holding a majority in the legislature. He also has constitutional restraints on what he can do in terms of things like formally declaring independence or changing the constitution of the Republic of China. And so the range of negative outcomes is not as great as is often seen. And the behavior of the three principal capitals up to this point encourages me to believe that we should be able to get our way through this transition in Taiwan without going into a crisis. Now, things can happen. Airplanes crash, ships bump into each other. People say things they didn't mean to say, or that they wish they hadn't said after they've said it. But I think on the whole, we're off to a fairly stable and status quo maintenance sort of start. And I take a lot of encouragement from that. Bonnie mentioned the Nauru transition. Nauru has, to my memory, has 4 times changed its recognition from Taiwan to the mainland and back.
Yep.
It's a very poor country with a very small population that is very, very dependent on outside aid, and so replaced on that symbolic gesture that was sent to indicate further diplomatic isolation of Taiwan through the mainland's efforts. This is something that Taiwan will survive. The political situation in Taiwan has been one where they've come to absorb these setbacks from time to time in ways that are much more healthy than maybe they were 25 years ago or so. And so I think on the whole, we've got a pretty good start. I would deflect our listeners' attention away from all the headlines about the military conflict to come, the commentators who are trying to build defense budgets in one country or another, and focus on what constructively can be maintained and build upon from this important point in this transition, which is the first point in the transition in Taiwan, before we experience several more in the months ahead. So we're going to need to see this kind of stability of behavior by the three capitals persist, to be maintained and to be encouraged. With that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Paal. Yes. Now it's Dawei. You are in the United States, and you are the guy. Both Bonnie and Mr. Paal was hoping to talk to, for a long time. Yes, hoping that we are going to work out something constructively. Talking about the position in China, we have to divide between, tactical approach and strategic approach, or tactical need and strategic need. As I said before, in the long run, in a strategic sense, things between the United States and China are not to compare at all, with what's used to going on 20 years ago. But still, in this year, at least in the year 2024, we still have strong need to make sure that nothing will be out of control for both domestic issue or whatever. But let me recall one fact, which is Liu Jianchao's visit to Washington, the Minister for the Asian Work of the Communist Party of China. People are talking about he will be the ongoing foreign minister of China. We don't know. We just forget about it. But anyhow, what he said in New York and maybe partially in Washington was very interesting. He said, very frankly and openly, in clear, I don't know, in clear English or in clear Chinese, he said China is not going to challenge the currently existing world order. We are the partially the shaper of this world order, and we are also the beneficial. We have benefited from this world order. So far as I remember, this is not something new, which was said by the side of China. But the last time the Chinese official says that goes back to Dai Bingguo and to Zheng Bijian, maybe 2008, 2006. That was another era of history. That's the that's another era of the history. But since the last 5 years, China has never mentioned this. China has been always said, we are at the center of the world international order. We are going to, reshape something. But also, if I can put this as an upline, which was said by Liu Jianchao, he also has some bottom line for the United States. He said, okay, at the same time, we're going to take seriously what Washington has promised us in terms of one China policy. And some days later, maybe 1 day or 2 days later, White House held a press briefing before the election, said very clearly, we're not going to support Taiwan's independence, which was again also said a few times, both by Clinton and even on the 1 day after the election by President Biden. So my question is, my first question is this a strategic change on the side of China, or is it just a tactical in terms of, making a deal with the United States? And also, in terms of the very bottom line of China in dealing with the forthcoming Lai Ching-te administration, is China still going to insist on the 92 consensus, or even on one country, two systems? We know one country, two systems. Behind one country, two systems concept is Hong Kong. And there's so much disagreement, and we can argue so much about what's going on, whether Hong Kong is successful and whether Hong Kong can be still seen as a model for unification with Taiwan. But even 92 consensus looks like it didn't work at all, neither with DPP nor even with the current Kuomintang leadership, KMT leadership. So I will leave up to you. I name this just also, as I said before, try to stimulate your further thought and wisdom. Okay, Dawei.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Peter, and thanks CGHK for having me and put me on this panel with distinguished experts like Bonnie and Doug. Yeah, back to the question. I think I don't think China have any strategic change in its position, no matter on Taiwan question or more broadly China-US or China's foreign policy, I think it's quite stable. I don't know if China will, the mainland side will continue to push for the Taiwan side, Lai Ching-te to accept to use 92 consensus. I don't, of course, we want him to say something or back to that position, but obviously it's impossible. But I think no matter it's one country, two system or 92 consensus or some other terms, I think the core here is the one China principle. I think this is the key. I think we want the leader in Taiwan to say something in the spirit of the one China principle. While what he will say in the inauguration speech, of course, we don't know. So this is a place that we need a creative thinking about this to say something to represent the one China principle. Having said that, I have no expectation towards Lai Ching-te for him to say anything that Beijing feel it's okay, it's creative. I don't think so. I don't think he can do that. I mean, Lai Ching-te, we know him. He's a pro-independent activist for a very long time, and I don't think he. I think he is even a radical version of Tsai Ing-wen. So the best hope is maybe he can continue Tsai Ing-wen's policy. He already said that. If he keep that promise, of course that will be good. I think in the upcoming inauguration speech, probably he won't say anything very provocative. This is my speculation, because I think no leader want to challenge or give himself a very difficult situation once he just take the office. I think even if in the future he want to say something or do something, I think that probably will happen in the when he tried to seek the re-election. So I don't think this year or next year he has very strong incentive to provoke the mainland side. Without provocation, I also don't think he will say anything creative, because this is not his fundamental position, not his, from his track record, from his long-standing position. I think, again, the best scenario will be just stick to what Tsai Ing-wen said and did. And Tsai Ing-wen in past 8 years actually also changed a lot. In her first inauguration speech to last year, the October 10th speech, I think she changed a lot. For the last October 10th speech, what she said was criticized by the mainland side as a new two-state theory, right? 新两国论. The mainland side criticized the Tsai Ing-wen sharply. I think the two, because Tsai said that two sides of Cross-Strait does not belong to each other. 互不隶属. I hope at the beginning of his term, Lai Ching-te won't say that kind of thing. Repeat the new two-state theory. Probably he can try to be less provocative, but again, I don't think he can say anything in the spirit of one China principle. So this is my hunch on the Taiwan issue. And you also mentioned the Liu Jianchao's speech in the United States, the overall China's foreign policy. I think what he said was quite clear. That I think it is a long time China's position. But the challenge here is first, China always believed that we have no aspiration to challenge the international order. and we are, part of the current existing international order. But the problem is, I think two problems. One is China's interpretation of its behavior vis-a-vis the international order is different from the Western country, from the United States. China think we stick to the international order, but the United States and other Western countries don't think in that way. They think that China, at least China, for example, even back to 10 years ago, China was in the order and take advantage of that order. So the US want to change that to end that. And at the same time, the other challenge is, I think, the United States or Western country are challenging the international order too. I mean, they want to change the international order. So the order today or in the future will not be the order we have been very familiar with after China joined the WTO in the first 10 years of this century. I think at that time, China and the US are more or less on the same page about the order. But now, on the one hand, the US criticized China for undermining the order. At the same time, I think the US also is unsatisfied with that order and want to at least reform it or want to change it. I mean, say goodbye to the neoliberalism that we are so familiar with after the end of the Cold War. So I am very happy that Minister Liu Jianchao reiterated China's position. I think that is reassuring, at least for the listeners. But the overall situation is changing. So I don't know if the Western listeners can agree with his argument or not. To sum up, I think there is no change in China's strategic direction. And Minister Liu made a very clear argument. I think that's helpful because there are so many different and sometimes contradictory voices from China. So he made that very clearly. That's of course helpful, but I think it cannot solve the differences between the two sides, between China and the United States.
Okay, thank you, Dawei. We also need to consider, Lai Ching-te used to say he is a pragmatical worker for Taiwanese independent movement. So the wording pragmatical leaves a lot of room for people to have a brainstorming, to have the imagination, to have an inference, whatever, in positive, negative sense or whatever. And also you mentioned you try to explain Liu Jianchao's position. Now, as I said before, things between the United States and China is totally different over the course of last 2 decades. If something like this was what have been said 20 years ago, very good, but now it's also very good in terms of the wording, but it's up to Washington to believe or not. So I mention this not because I want to stimulate some conflict, because I want to, make it brainstorming on the level of tactical approach between Beijing and Washington in influence, Lai Ching-te. If there's a deep-sitting trust between France, things could be moving on very smoothly. If there's a not very deep-sitting trust, things could be moving, tactically, maybe in some correct way, maybe in the long run could be running in a different way. So, Bonnie and Mr. Paal, so I'm always a simple and naive journalist. Maybe let me try to ask a naive question. Do you believe what Liu Jianchao said in terms of that China is not going to challenge the current existing world order, and with the macro background of that both Washington and China needs to focus on influence Lai Ching-te in this year, particularly in terms of the May 20th of May inauguration speech. So in the macro strategic background, do you trust? And in the macro background, do you think both China and Washington, with this macro background, whether you trust or not, can influence Lai Ching-te? Bonnie.
Peter, I'm not sure I see any connection between China's policies and the international order and the question that you raise of whether the United States and or Beijing can shape in some way Lai Ching-te's policies. I fail to see that connection. I can give you an entire lecture on how China is trying to revise the international order, maybe not upend it, but there's growing evidence in both statements by Xi Jinping and senior Chinese officials and actions undermining the US dollar as the dominant currency, trying to change the definition of human rights in the UN Human Rights Council. I mean, there are so many examples, but Dawei makes the point, which I accept, that from Beijing's perspective, this is not changing the international order. But we see, I think, growing evidence that China is trying to insert its own norms and values and its practices and its standards into the international order. And you will not have failed to notice that there are statements in our national security strategy and in the China strategy that Tony Blinken put forward in his speech that essentially say China is the only country in the world that has both the ambition and the capability to revise the international order. So this has become, I think, a consensus position within the Biden administration, and I think is widely shared. That's not to say that there are some who disagree, but it's only a matter of degree, whether and the extent to which China's ambitions are toward the international order. But I think that's fundamentally separate, and I don't know whether you really want to pursue that line of discussion or talk more about Taiwan. But I will say that Lai Ching-te, I think, has an important stake in preserving good relations with the United States and not fundamentally causing a confrontation with Beijing. I think I said in my introductory comments, he doesn't want a military conflict. So I don't think that's his intention. But the United States is not going to write Lai Ching-te's inaugural address. So let's be perfectly clear about that, right? We are not going to even write, one or two sentences of it. If we hear interesting and creative suggestions from people in mainland China, we will convey them, whether that be experts like me or US officials, because we would like to see a creative understanding between the two sides of the strait that would enable a resumption of their more official communication. If there is a direct channel, a secret channel between Beijing and Taipei, that's even better. It didn't work too well when Tsai Ing-wen was running for president. There were several channels, and they ended up not producing the outcome that Tsai Ing-wen had hoped for. So I don't know if Lai Ching-te would really put much stock in that kind of effort, but if the opportunity is there, I think he would explore it. So yes, the US can play a role in making suggestions and conveying things that we hear from people in mainland China. But no, we are not going to pressure Lai. We are not going to seek to write any part of his speech. And ultimately, they are going to make their own choices as to what they say. And the United States respects their ability to do that. He is the elected president of Taiwan, and he has every right to say whatever he wants to say in his inaugural address.
Okay, now it's maybe it takes a while. It takes years and decades for both capitals, Beijing and Washington, to test their bottom line, to try their trust. Okay, let me put this naive question aside. Let's focus more on creative ideas of how to influence and how to make sure that nothing will be out of control before and after the 10th of May. Dawei, you mentioned before you hope that Lai Ching-te is going to say something in the spirit of One China principle. What could that be? In the spirit of One China principle. Anyhow, he needs to say something, but you say, no one was expecting to see here, oh, I'm Lai Ching-te, I'm going to support one country, two system, I'm going to support 92 consensus, unless he's crazy. What could that be? What kind of wording, formulation would you accept when you say One China principle, in the spirit of One China principle could be accepted?
Yeah, I think Bonnie said that the U.S. will not write the speech, inauguration speech. Obviously, the mainland side will will not write that speech even for a sentence. But if I were him, I may think about, you know, he was elected as the leader of the ROC. I use a quotation mark here. So I think the two sides, I mean, the two sides of Cross-Strait do share some One China principle in the two sides' constitutions. Why? Of course, the mainland side does not admit that's a constitution, but that's a basic law of Taiwan Authority. I think the basic laws of the two sides in these two laws, I mean, those are the One China Constitution, One China Basic Law. So and he was elected as a leader and should abide that law. So I think that's the direction he need to think about, I think. But unfortunately, during the debate before the election, when he asked about this constitution, he said it's dangerous, right? I think he said something weird about that. Very unfortunate. So, and again, I don't know what he can say. I think it's his turn to be creative. If he's not creative, it's okay because I don't have any expectation, and I don't think the mainland side have any expectation. And to be honest, even if he says something, of course that's very positive, but it cannot solve the distrust between the two across the strait, right? The mainland side will not be naive to trust them or to change our policy overnight because he says something nice. Of course, I want him to say something that will be constructive. And another point I want to make is to your so-called, you said it's naive. I don't think it's naive question, but this question you asked Bonnie earlier, I think China and the US I don't think we can cooperate on Taiwan issue now, but we may do something towards the same direction. I mean, the mainland side, the mainland China do something and the US do something separately, but towards the same direction. I think that's possible. The US will do something in the same direction with China because that is in the US interest, not because it's in China's interest. It's in the US interest. And what is both in China and the US interest? I think to avoid a war. This is, the interest that all sides, all three parties pursued. So I think to avoid a very dangerous situation, I think the Biden administration has already done something like before the election, I think quietly convey the American side's position to Lai. And when Lai say something dangerous, for example, marching into the White House, this kind of thing, I think the US side expressed their, I think, unhappiness about that. And after the election, or before election, as Peter mentioned earlier, that the U.S. government repeated its long-time position of do not support the Taiwan independence. And after the election, sent former senior official to Taiwan, try to reiterate the U.S. long-time policy. I think all those things are in the same direction with China. So I won't call it a cooperation. It's a self-interest action, but it's welcome, I think. But of course, at the same time, I have to say, sometimes from the mainland China's perspective, if the only common position between China and the US is to avoid a war, I think the bar is very low, very low. And some people in China may think that the only language that we share, the only language that the United States understand is a gun and a cannon. I think that's not good. That's not constructive. So I hope that China and the United States can gradually improve that bar. I mean, not just avoiding the. Of course, that's the bottom line. Of course, that's important. But that line is low, is quite low, and we can only prevent the worst scenario. That's not enough, I think. Yes, Peter.
Okay, Dawei, I like the word you used when you said it before, self-interest action. That's very creative, yeah, self-interest action. So what does it mean? Does it mean that there's coordination between the United States and China, even very loose coordination between Washington and Beijing in this issue, or there's not at all, that both sides are just acting separately by themselves?
I think both sides pursue their policies separately. It's not again the U.S. doing that not in sake of China, not to just to improve China-U.S. relations. I don't think so. I think it's serving the U.S. interest. But of course, in that process, before any major actions, I think of course the China and the U.S. coordinate, or at least we communicate to each other, and we understand each other's position, right? We convey our signal clearly. So to avoid misunderstanding. And I think with that, if we clearly understand the situation, the two sides clearly understand the situation, and we clearly understand the other side's interest, and we clearly understand how dangerous the situation is, I think then the two sides, both China and the United States, will do something separately, but because we still have some shared interest. Right? Peace, stability, that's a shared interest. So we can do something separately, but towards the same direction.
Yeah, Mr. Paal, 20 years ago, I assume both China and the United States, they also did such kind of, as Dawei mentioned, self-interest action. But 20 years ago, was there any coordination between Beijing and Washington before the 20th of May? Or not at all?
I was not in the government at that moment, and so I'll speak generally, which is I doubt there was anything like coordination. To expand a little bit on Dawei's points, diplomacy takes place in two ways. One is private communication, the other is public communication, and sometimes you do some symbolic things. In the case of each side having its own bottom line, that's best communicated privately and maybe symbolized publicly, but not spelled out in detail in public discourse. What you try to do in public is try to find common bonds. Our peoples breathe the same air. We look for the same safe foods. We want to fly on safe airlines. We want to have the benefit of global health programs. And there's a lot of scope for Taiwan and China to be part of the global community because they have common needs. But when it comes to our bottom line with respect to pressure on Taiwan or what Taiwan should do with the mainland or China's bottom line toward the US or Taiwan, those are best conveyed privately. And diplomats should, while doing a responsible job of communicating those basic interests to each other so that there's the principle of no surprises is maintained. At the same time, creative diplomats are always going to try to find something in common that allows the parties a platform on which to work together, if not shoulder to shoulder, at least to a common purpose. And I think there's still plenty of room for Taiwan and China to avoid the legalistic arguments and still share a common purpose. When Taiwan sends assistance to mainland earthquake victims, for example, this is the sort of thing I'm talking about.
Okay, now let's move one more step further on. Furthermore, try to be more strategic, creative. So Bonnie and Mr. Paal, yeah, both also that way. What could be accepted by Beijing and Washington when it goes down to for Lai Ching-te to say something on the 20th of May? Shall we give him a not to do list, a negative list, or shall we give him a positive list? Just like when we are talking about trade, or not at all, just fully leave up to him. We just sending him a signal and without telling him what to do or what not to do, just like Dawie said, hoping that he could say something in the spirit of one China policy. But how about if he's not going to say? Or Dawie said, okay, I'm okay if he's not going to say anything. I'm not raising hope on him anyhow. But maybe things are going to be a disaster after the 20th of May. Should we give him a negative list of not to say, or a positive list of what to say, or what could be done? In terms of the positive list, let me go back to the very famous article written by Bonnie and along with some other colleagues. I do think this article is very creative. It's very creative. And you mentioned the United States should not only threaten, but to reassure China. So which reminded me to James Dunbook when he coined the phrase over 10 years ago in terms of strategic reassurance between the United States and China. Going back to 10 years ago, it was seen as a little bit too theoretic, too abstract, too naive, didn't work. But now 10 years later, people will say that's the bottom line. If both the United States and China, along with Lai Ching-te, we never said where is our bottom line. We never could assure between our three parties, things are never going to work. Again, now for me, still pragmatically, it still looks a bit very theoretical, very logical. But without logics, nothing could be done. Nothing could be moving on towards. And also, you clearly mentioned, which actually became a hotline, a big news in the world community. You clearly suggested Lai Ching-te to suspend independency paragraph in the DPP charter. So, but again, which also caused some disagreement, caused some conspiracy theories. Hey, why do Bonnie and Jessica Chen and so the American scholar rises because they want to support Taiwan's de facto independency, right? People were trying to read what you wrote from the point of view of conspiracy theory. Now, okay, now it's your turn to clarify what you really think. Yeah, as I said before, from my point of view, I think, because I conducted a long interview with James Dunbook in 2016 in Singapore. I know he coins the phrase strategic reassurance. I know it didn't work very well going back to 10 years ago. But now I don't know whether there's a connection between that President Biden sending him to Taipei. I don't know. But based on what Liu Jianchao said in New York, in the sense of China is not going to change the current existing order, I do think some hints 10 years later between both capitals in terms of, okay, we're trying to make assurance to each other, maybe in a very superficial, very, very fragile way, but still this is a very good thing. Yeah, very good signal, very good hints, which we definitely need to try to maintain. So, Bonnie, maybe I say too much. Now it's up to you too.
I will start by saying that it's a good thing that the article that Tom and Jessica and I co-authored has stimulated a great deal of debate, a lot of criticism, but also I think a lot of praise. That's the role of a think tank expert, is to write something that stimulates debate and discussion. So I think that we've achieved that goal. But I think that many people have distorted its meaning, or perhaps like selectively cited things from the article and taken them out of context, especially the suggestion that we made about freezing or suspending the Taiwan independence plank from the 1991 DPP party platform. And I think that what often people lose sight of is that the article was not about what Lai Ching-te should do or Taiwan should do. The article was about how to preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait and how to make deterrence credible. And too many people talk about deterrence and reassurance as separate things and say both are important. What we try to explain in this article is that assurance is an integral, inseparable part of deterrence. Deterrence is not just a military concept, which many people believe it is, that as long as you have sufficient hard power, you can deter. But if we have an enormous amount of hard power, but we do not assure Beijing that the United States will not diplomatically recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign state, or assure Beijing that we will not revive the mutual defense treaty that we abrogated with Taiwan in 1979, can we really expect that simply our hard power will be effective in deterring? And we quote in our article an example that Thomas Schelling gave, because he is the well-known Nobel Prize-winning political scientist who wrote about this. And he said, you know, if a person has a gun and you say, stop or I'll shoot, that target, that person needs to have confidence that if they stop, you will not shoot. And so assurance is absolutely essential. Otherwise, you cannot effectively deter. And we make the argument that as the United States is going about bolstering deterrence, which is necessary, as we are trying to bolster the hard power component of deterrence, we also have to strengthen the assurance component of deterrence. So I see a question that somebody sent in, you know, basically suggesting assurance equals appeasement. People have said, you know, assurance is concession. I tell people, read the article. Clearly, anybody who asks that question has not read the article, because I think we explain why assurances are necessary, why all three sides have to make assurance credible, and that credible threats are insufficient in order to make deterrence hold. And I believe that all three sides can do a better job in making their assurances credible. So the suggestions we offered are simply some of the things that Washington, Beijing, and Taipei could do. There are other things, but the suggestion specifically that we made about freezing that independence plank is not new. It was discussed 10 years ago. There were members of the DPP, including legislators, who publicly supported it. It was also proposed by Richard Bush, the former AIT chair, in a speech in Taiwan this past March. So, you know, we didn't invent this proposal, and it is completely up to Taiwan whether they think this is a good idea, or maybe they have other ways to assure Beijing that they will not pursue independence. And I'll just remind everyone that Tsai Ing-wen's inaugural speech in 2016 was a serious effort to assure Beijing that Taiwan was not going to pursue independence. And she not only said that she would adhere to the act governing relations across the Taiwan Strait and the ROC Constitution, but she also referred to the talks that took place in 1992 without saying the 1992 consensus. I think she went more than halfway toward showing goodwill toward Beijing. She tried to provide assurance, and Beijing did not react favorably. I think that was a mistake. I don't know whether Lai Ching-do will say similar things in his inaugural speech, but I believe he has already tried to offer some assurances, and I hope that Beijing will respond positively.
Okay, Dawei. So before I ask Mr. Paal to respond, maybe Dawei first.
Yeah.
You're not talking about on behalf of Beijing, but you're talking about, yourself, actually.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is, of course, my personal view. I think let's imagine there are several lines. For example, one line is, for example, when Lai Ching-do visited the United States last year, during the interview, he said Taiwan is already a sovereign state. I think that is what he said in the U.S. My personal view is this is de jure independence. I think it's very, very serious to say, particularly as a leader of Taiwan, to say Taiwan is already is a de jure state. And then another line is, let's say, for example, when Tsai Ing-wen said the two sides across the street, or what he said actually was the PRC and ROC does not subordinate to each other, right? This is another line. I will say this is two Chinas, or one China, one Taiwan. I think this is, all those things are, they emphasize the separation of the two sides, and the legal position of the two sides. They do not subordinate to each other. They are independent. I mean, I hope Lai Ching-do will not go that far. I mean, in his inauguration speech, I don't know where will he reach. I mean, but those two lines are unacceptable. If he do something in his inauguration speech, that's totally unacceptable. And I hope he can do something to emphasize the linkage of the two sides, the links of the two sides, culturally, economically, politically, and legally. Most important thing is legal status. I think Bonnie just mentioned about the policy, what his policy, or what 8 years ago Tsai Ing-wen emphasized her policy won't pursue independence. Why mainland China did not accept that? Actually, we worry about the policy, of course, but we care more about the legal status. How do they interpret the legal status of Taiwan, mainland China, this kind of thing? When she rejected 92 consensus 8 years ago, then actually she cut the legal basis for one China, which Ma Ying-jeou administration, insists during his 8 years. So he undermined that legal basis of one China. So again, two things. One is the legal status. The other is policy. Of course, it will be welcome if Lai Ching-do say something to imply that he will have a moderate, stable policy. Okay, welcome. But at the same time, we will also notice, we'll follow what he said about the legal status of Taiwan, of China, of the two sides. In that regard, I hope he say something, emphasize the links between across the two sides, rather than the separation of the two sides. So again, I cannot write a speech for him, but I hope I want to clarify those points to maybe if he watched this video, maybe for his reference.
Of course, nobody of us can write some speech for him, but maybe we can influence his playbook. So, which goes back to what I said before. Shall we give him a negative list in terms of not to do, or shall we give him a positive list in terms of how creative he could be? Again, it's a naive question, Mr. Paal. Creative people are always starting with naive idea.
Well, I remember well Tsai Ing-wen's first inaugural address, and it always seemed to me somewhat unsurprising, unfortunately, but also disappointing that China did not seek to respond to that speech more creatively, to take what she had and try to put their own spin on it so that they could live with the result. One of the successes of diplomacy that, if you accept a war is worth fighting, okay, then throw out everything I'm about to say. But if war is something you want to avoid, then you want to establish a scope of ambiguity and live with that ambiguity so you don't have to face the stark choice of war versus peace. And ambiguity is not unlimited. There are things you don't do. And in the American position with respect to Taiwan and China, we are clear that we do not promote or support independence that's not reached by consensus on the question of Taiwan's future. And within that delineation, there's a lot of room for ambiguous behavior that all three sides should be able to live with. And the ambiguity happens to suit all of our interests, in my view. And the question is, how do you persuade diplomats or officials at the top of the system to preserve that sphere of ambiguity and not transgress its outer limits? I think that's what we're facing in the period running up to this inaugural test in May. And again and again going forward, we will face this question. How do you constructively work diplomatically to preserve the prospect for peace and avoid unnecessary conflict?
Peter, can I say something? Add something? Sure. Yeah, I think both Doug and Peter, I think along with other American scholars, always say China missed the opportunity 8 years ago when Tsai Ing-wen seemed to extend an olive branch, right? But why China didn't accept that branch? I think we don't think that's an olive branch. I just now I said the policy thing and the legal status thing. So China and the United States, we have different interpretation regarding the term status quo. So for the U.S., I think the status quo is more or less about the stability, peace. That's if you want to maintain peace and stability. Since they gave you a moderate posture, moderate policy promise that I won't pursue this de jure independence. I want peaceful coexistence. It sounds like maintaining status quo, and China should accept. But from China's perspective, the status quo is first and foremost, it's about the legal status of Taiwan. Taiwan is part of China. This is the status quo. This position not only be issued by the two sides across the strait for decades, and also like in Shanghai Communique, the U.S. side acknowledged that the two sides have that. I mean, at least the U.S. at that time witnessed, and know that the two sides across the strait believe that there is one China. And the two sides pursue that. I mean, the Taiwan side continuously changing that status quo, change the status of Taiwan's legal position from the one China principle to two-state theory, to other things, to the new two-state theory. So how can China accept that? That's not an olive branch. That's a bitter fruits that we cannot swallow, I think. So that's the reason. So I hope that Lai Ching-te can think about that and stop stop, compromise this legal position of legal status of the Taiwan issue. I think this is the core. China's goal is not, of course, we want peace and stability, but the more important goal for China is reunification, or at least to prevent the Taiwan independence. I think this is the most important goal of China. So China cannot say, let them go and keep the peace and stability. This is not the China side's position. So that's a fundamental difference between China and the US.
Okay, thank you. Now, today is here in Hong Kong is 19th of January. Here in the US, till the 18th of January. That is almost 1 week after election in Taiwan. A little bit more than 2 months after the summit between the two presidents in California. Now it's finally, hopefully, as everyone said before, it could be a good start. As I try to put, it could be a good starting and a testing point, both between three sides and also between two capitals. Bonnie, your article, as I said many times before, is really creative in a sense. It could stimulate, not necessarily you reach a consensus, but stimulate the thoughts in three capitals. But do you think now, as I said before, 2 months after the China-US summit, almost 1 week after this election, since everyone is testing both for Lai and both between Washington and Beijing, do you think we can build up, or do we already see some common ground for your suggestions, in the sense that all the three parties need to assure, at least partially start to assure, or there's no ground at all? At least what I saw a few weeks ago, almost 2 or 3 weeks after you published your article, the spokesman of Lai Ching-te, he came out. He received an interview from Deutsche Welle, which is a German foreign language broadcast, which I also used to work 30 years ago. And he said, now it's premature for us to say that, but maybe sometimes after the election, we could try to consider, in terms of what you suggested, freezing or suspending the independence paragraph in the DPP charter. So now it's almost 1 week after this election. We still have 4 months until the 20th of May. We are just sitting in the middle, and a very interesting timing. If we could be creative, constructive, we can get something done. If we still remain dumb as before, nothing, everything could be disaster. Do you see partially some common ground for your suggestions? And also, by the way, everyone mentioned many times before the wording avoiding conflict, avoiding a war, avoiding Taiwanese independence, avoiding impression. Bonnie, you wrote in the article, let me read out. It must avoid, yeah, you meant United States. It must avoid giving impression that it is moving towards restoring formal diplomatic relations or a defense alliance with the island, combined with a conditional and a credible threat of a military response by the United States and Taiwan to the use of force. Such assurance will help prevent a war. So this is, of course, a suggestion to Washington. What do you think? Now, do you see some common ground? Or at least
it's very difficult to answer, Peter. I'm a little discouraged by Dawei's comments,
wow.
though they don't surprise me. The question is avoiding separation and making Taiwan a de jure independent state. Preventing those goals, is that enough? Or does Beijing have to move toward unification? If it is sufficient to live with ambiguity and prevent Taiwan from becoming de jure independent, I think that's doable. I don't think that that Lai Ching-te has the ambition to make Taiwan into an independent sovereign state. And even though maybe in his heart that's what he wants, I think he understands the risks are too high, and I don't think he'll pursue it. But if you say that unification has to be achieved, and when Xi Jinping implies in his statements to President Biden that he's becoming a little impatient and wants to make progress toward this goal of reunification, then I get very nervous. I don't think that Lai Ching-te can say anything in his inaugural address, and I could be wrong, so this is, of course, just my personal view, but I doubt that he would say anything that would imply that Taiwan's legal status is somehow that it is part of China. I don't think he will say Taiwan is an independent sovereign state. He might say the ROC is an independent sovereign state, but every leader of Taiwan since Lee Teng-hui has said that the ROC is an independent sovereign state. So my fear is that Beijing is just going to set the bar too high. And the way that you have suggested the things that Lai Ching-te should say or rule out may be setting that bar a little high. And I think that's what happened with Tsai Ing-wen in 2016, that Beijing set the bar so high that it was impossible for Tsai Ing-wen to cross that hurdle and satisfy Beijing's demands. And my hope is that some lessons were learned from that period, and that Beijing can lower the bar a little bit and come up with, as Peter said, a creative way to express the fact that somehow ambiguity is good enough for the time being, as long as Taiwan doesn't move towards a separate sovereign status. But if that's not good enough, then I'm very pessimistic.
So let me recall one more historical fact. With growing age, people always remember the core history. On the 21st of December, 2007, that was 16 years ago, the then Chinese president made an annual speech, right? So annual television speech where he said a very clear sentence, which was very interesting and constructive for everyone. He said, we are now at a very special stage before unification of the country. At this special stage before unification of the country, he meant both mainland China and Taiwan, let's talk about the political framework between our both sides. So which was very interesting. So immediately I called the people, from Taiwan and mainland China to talk about in a constructive way. So again, that was the historical fact 16 years ago. Could we? Of course, we cannot go back. Everyone knows, things have changed. So is this a sort of something which we can still imagine or not, everyone? Dawei or Mr. Paal?
Sorry, I didn't catch your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, is this still something which we can imagine in a very ambiguous, vague wording, but more in a constructive sense, giving people, avoiding some impression and giving people also some impression, but also still, as you said it before, in the spirit of one country principle. At a special stage for unification of the country, let's talk about political framework of our both sides.
I don't think I think it's possible for some ambiguity here. I mean, if he do not say anything explicitly linked to Taiwan independence or, two Chinas, one China, one Taiwan, I think that can, so long as he keep distance from those rhetoric, and even if there is no creative new expression, I think we can still keep the ambiguity. And back to Bonnie's earlier remark, I think if his speech and in the future his remarks and policy gave the mainland side hope that the unification is still possible, even in the very, very long term, it's still possible. I think then China the mainland side will be satisfied, to limit the goal, to set the goal at preventing Taiwan independence. But if he keeps on moving, to erode the one China policy principle and drag China towards another direction, I think he will push the mainland side to set the goal at pursuing the reunification. So this is the situation he faced.
Okay, Mr. Paal, do you have something to comment?
Well, I don't have unrealistic expectations for a warm response to whatever Lai Ching-te has to say at his inaugural address. But to the extent China can minimize what it has to say and be as oblique and indirect as possible, and furthermore, to the extent that Lai Ching-te and American responses can also be similarly non-specific and unclear, I think we will all benefit from a prolonged period of peace.
Okay. So the time is running out. Let me just pick up one question for Bonnie, maybe somewhere else to answer. A question for the American guest. What would you suggest the U.S. to do to manage the situation or the perceivable tensions brought by the election results? And also, given the fact what Bonnie wrote, you suggested that Washington should avoid giving impressions that it's moving towards restoring former regimes or defense alliance with Taiwan. So that could be also a dilemma for Washington. Maybe short answer. Bonnie?
You are muted.
Yeah, you are muted.
Okay, figured it out. Sorry. So very quick answer. I think that first, I don't accept the notion that the outcome of the Taiwan elections were somehow increased tensions or instability. But I do want to underscore that one of the main messages of our article was that the United States has been somewhat inconsistent in its messaging, and sometimes its actions have not been consistent with its rhetoric. And so I have strongly urged U.S. officials to give a speech about our One China policy, why Taiwan matters to the United States, because frankly, I think that the American people have a right to know, and they should understand what our One China policy is. When officials say it's the Taiwan Relations Act and the 3 joint U.S.-China communiques and the 6 assurances, that should be the start of the explanation, but not the end of it, because Americans don't know what those documents are, nor should we really expect them to. And the rest of the world doesn't necessarily know either. There was a very good statement by a U.S. official, which I would recommend to everyone. There was a National Security Council official who gave a background briefing to the press just before the elections. And there's a couple of paragraphs which I posted on Twitter and said that I thought it was the clearest and most comprehensive statement by a U.S. official thus far in the Biden administration. And it not only reiterates and reaffirms the things that have been said by other officials, but it repeats a sentence that is part of U.S. policy, but has not been said for a very long time, which, and I will paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me, but essentially says that the United States emphasizes process, not outcomes, that we are not, we would accept any outcome that is peacefully negotiated or reached between the 2 sides of the strait. I think that's an important part of U.S. policy, in addition to things like we don't support Taiwan independence, we oppose unilateral changes in the status quo, we insist on peaceful resolution. And so I think that having U.S. officials state clearly what our policy is and is not, and helping the world to understand it, what our one China policy is important. This is part of assurance, in my view, to show that the United States is credible in the commitments it has made. Because if Beijing concludes that the US one China policy has really evaporated and is no longer credible, then we have entered a dangerous place that I think is not in the interests of the United States, China, or Taiwan. So that is my recommendation for Washington. And again, I want to emphasize that although we haven't talked about them tonight, that I did make recommendations along with Tom and Jessica of things that Beijing should do, including restoring the status quo ante as far as the military activity and exercises go in the Taiwan Strait, to actually pull back the activity to the mainland China's side of the median line. And I think that would be a gesture of goodwill to Taiwan. And I have no confidence, or very low confidence, that Beijing will do it. But that is just, again, one suggestion that we made in our article. I think all three sides need to make their assurances more credible.
Yeah, Bonnie, I still remember what you used to do 15 to 16 years ago between Taiwan and mainland China in terms of confidence building measures. This is the new word which I learned from you, between two militaries. Now
yeah, I didn't invent it.
Confidence.
It goes back to the World War II and the Cold War and Europe. Yeah. And so, right, military confidence building measures, or what used to be called CSBMs, confidence and security building measures.
Yeah. Things really have changed. Okay, Mr. Paal, last but not least, Mr. Paal and Dawei, your answer to the same questions, maybe very short. What do you suggest both Washington and Beijing to act in this scenario in a constructive way?
Well, I think less action is better. I'm very much in line with Bonnie's recommendations as she's just articulated them. The goal here is to preserve ambiguity, not to destroy it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Dawei, last but not least.
Yes, I totally agree with what Doug said. Less action is maybe the best solution, and at the same time, I think Washington and Beijing should communicate more, dialogue more on China-US on this cross-strait relationship. And I think on the mainland side, on the reassuring measures, I hope maybe the mainland side need to consider in the future how to reopen the people-to-people tie with Taiwan, and also maintain or even increase the economic interaction with Taiwan side. Leave the political dispute aside to let the people talk to each other.
Okay, thank you, everyone. It's really a historical turning point. Let's wait and see, and let's try to make our contribution to that. Now, let me ask Sheldon to come out to round up very short.
Yeah, thank you everyone for this fantastic panels. I take a lot of notes, and I hope like Beijing and Washington or either Taipei can accept all the esteemed panelists' suggestions, and that they probably lower the tension across the strait, and also like maintain the peace and stability of the whole Indo-Pacific area. So earnest thanks to all the colleagues, friends, and scholars, and even supporters. I saw the South China Morning Post, or also other medias were coming to join us today. Your active participation is crucial to us, and also we really value your insights and your input on this critical issues. So if you have any questions, concerns, or shared interest in collaboration among the research institution, so I encourage you to explore our website, and don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email is sheldonxie@cghk.com. So your engagement is really instrumental, and we hope to hold this kind of panels on the critical issues. We plan to have a kind of panels, also a series, a dialogue series on the two sessions about the two sessions of the PRC in March, probably around the March or late March. So please keep an eye on that, and I will, if there's any updates, I will put on our Twitter or LinkedIn to make you guys keep you guys informed. So have a good night. I think it is a little bit late in the East Coast or either the West Coast, and have a good rest of the day, like in China for all our panelists or audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dawei. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Paal.
Bye bye.
All the best.
Yeah,
See you next
thank you.
time.
Bye.
Yeah, see you next time.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
okay, enjoy your time. Yeah.